I never thought much about the renovation process. After all, we had a beautiful house, a growing family, and I had my work to keep me busy. When my wife, Laura, suggested we renovate the kitchen and backyard patio, it seemed like a natural progression. I've been working long hours lately, and Laura was managing everything at home. So, when she mentioned hiring a young contractor, a builder she had found through a neighbor, I didn't question it. "It's just a couple of months of work," she said one evening over dinner. "He seems like a nice guy. Really knows his stuff." I nodded, not giving it much thought. I trusted her judgment. After all, she ran the household, managed the kids, and handled anything related to the house. The idea of someone else fixing up the place while I focused on work was a relief. The builder's name was Travis. Young, in his mid-20s, with the look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. Tan skin, strong hands, and a casual confidence that made him approachable. He was polite, always friendly, and worked hard. Laura introduced us the first day he arrived. They had already developed a rapport that felt professional, at least from what I saw. At first, everything seemed completely normal. Travis would show up around 8 a.m., work through the day, and sometimes stay late to finish a task. I rarely interacted with him beyond a quick hello in the mornings before I left for the office, or a casual nod when I returned in the evenings. Laura would sometimes bring him water or coffee, and they'd chat briefly about the renovation. I remember one day, specifically about a month into the project. I came home earlier than usual, walking through the back door just as the two of them were standing close together, laughing about something. It was a harmless enough scene, but something tugged at the back of my mind. Laura was laughing a little too hard, her body angled toward him in a way that seemed different. But I brushed it off. They were working together, and she was just being friendly, right? Still, after that I started paying more attention, noticing things I hadn't before. The way Travis would always seem to find something to fix just as Laura walked outside. Or how he stayed later than I expected, sometimes working well into the evening, even after dinner. I didn't question it. Maybe I should have. "How's everything going with the Reno?" I asked one night, sitting next to Laura on the couch. She was scrolling through her phone, her legs tucked under her. "Good," she replied, not looking up. "Travis is really making progress. The kitchen will be done in no time." I smiled, relieved that at least one thing was going smoothly. I was preoccupied with work, trying to close a big deal that had been dragging on for months, and I didn't have the energy to micromanage the renovation. Laura was handling everything, or so I thought. The subtle changes started to show soon after. Laura had always been open with me, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her frustrations. But lately, she'd become distant, as though something was occupying her mind. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of the renovation and the added mess in the house. But the more I tried to engage her, the more she withdrew. "You've been quiet lately," I said one evening, watching her as she prepared dinner. She didn't meet my eyes, focusing instead on chopping vegetables. "Just tired, I guess," she mumbled. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Travis was always around, and Laura seemed distracted. We barely spoke beyond the usual pleasantries. Our once regular nights out turned into evenings where she'd make excuses to stay home, often mentioning how tired she was from dealing with the renovations. And I believed her. She was probably exhausted from managing the house while I was busy at work. It made sense, but then there were the little things. The glances they exchanged when they didn't think I was watching. The way she seemed to brighten up when he arrived. How her mood shifted depending on his presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but every time I tried to bring it up, I second-guessed myself. Was I being paranoid? Maybe I was just imagining things. After all, they were working closely together, and it was a stressful time. Surely that was it. Then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had come home later than usual after a meeting ran long. As I walked into the house, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Laura's laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like weeks. Curious, I headed toward the noise, but as I approached, I hesitated. Peeking around the corner, I saw them standing close, too close. Laura had her hand on his arm, and they were laughing at some inside joke. My heart sank. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that they were just being friendly, but the way she looked at him, the way he smiled at her, It was too familiar, too intimate. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I confront them? Walk in and pretend like I hadn't noticed anything? My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. Instead, I backed away, retreating to my office upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. Every instinct in me told me something was happening, but I had no proof, no concrete reason to accuse her of anything. If I confronted her, I could just as easily be wrong and end up pushing her away even more. So I stayed silent, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. But deep down, I knew. The cracks in our marriage were starting to show, and I wasn't sure if they could be repaired. Weeks passed, and with each day, the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my gut only grew stronger. I found myself observing more, watching their interactions like a spectator on the outside of my own life. Every morning, Travis would arrive at the house, toolbox in hand, ready to work on whatever task needed finishing that day. Laura greeted him at the door, always with a smile that seemed just a little too bright. I told myself it was nothing, that this was what people did when working on a project together. But no matter how many times I reassured myself, something didn't sit right. There were too many moments I couldn't shake from my mind. One day, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, which was odd considering Travis was usually hammering away on some part of the renovation. I made my way toward the back, looking for Laura or him, but what I heard stopped me in my tracks. Laughter, low, quiet, and intimate. It wasn't the kind of laughter you shared with a contractor or someone you barely knew. It was the kind of laughter that came with familiarity, with closeness. I stood there, just outside the kitchen, my body tense as their voices floated through the hallway. They were talking, their words too muffled to make out, but the tone told me everything I needed to know. There was a softness in Laura's voice that I hadn't heard in months, a tenderness that used to be reserved for me. I stood there, feeling like an intruder in my own home, like I had somehow become the outsider. My mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that had become my marriage. How long had this been going on? Was it even happening? Or was I just overreacting? Maybe they were just getting along, but every time I tried to rationalize it, I knew I was lying to myself. That night, lying next to Laura in bed, I couldn't bring myself to ask the questions that had been eating away at me for weeks. I watched her sleep, her face peaceful and undisturbed, while my mind ran wild with doubts and insecurities. I could feel the distance between us growing, a chasm that I didn't know how to cross. There had been a time when I could ask her anything, when we shared everything without hesitation. But that time felt like a lifetime ago. Now, there was a wall between us, built brick by brick, with every late-night conversation she had with Travis, every laugh they shared, every time I caught them in those small, intimate moments. One Friday, I took the day off work, telling Laura I needed a break. "I've been swamped with meetings," I explained over breakfast. She nodded, barely looking up from her phone. I could tell she was distracted, probably thinking about the renovation and the list of tasks she had planned for the day. "Travis is coming by today to finish up the patio," she said, almost as an afterthought. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, that's good. It'll be nice to have that done. He's been working really hard on it," she added, her tone casual. "I think he's almost finished." I didn't say much after that, but my mind was working overtime. I decided that I needed to know more. The house was quiet when Travis arrived later that morning. I was in my office pretending to work, but really I was waiting, listening. It didn't take long before I heard the familiar sound of their voices drifting from the kitchen. I waited, biding my time until I knew they were occupied with their conversation. Then I slipped out of the office and quietly made my way down the hallway. I felt like a man on a mission, my heart pounding in my chest as I moved toward the source of their voices. When I reached the edge of the kitchen, I hesitated, staying hidden just out of view. Their conversation was easy, natural, too natural. "You're really good at this, you know?" Laura's voice was light, playful. "Thanks," Travis replied, a smile in his voice. "I try my best." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the shift in the air. It felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. I inched closer, my back pressed against the wall as I tried to make out what was happening. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Laura said softly, and the way she said it made my stomach turn. There was a silence that followed, and in that silence, my mind raced, filling in the blanks. I wanted to barge in, to stop whatever was happening, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the fear of what I might find. Finally, Travis spoke, his voice low. "You're doing just fine, Laura. You don't need me." There was something in the way he said her name, too familiar, too intimate. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought I might walk into the room, demand answers, confront them both. But I stayed where I was, listening, waiting for something, anything, that would confirm what I was beginning to fear. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I avoided Laura, making excuses to leave the house whenever I could. I wasn't ready to face her, to ask the questions that were clawing at the back of my mind. Instead, I went for a drive, hoping that getting out of the house would clear my head. But no matter how many miles I put between myself and home, the thoughts followed me, circling like vultures. When I finally returned home that evening, Travis was gone, and Laura was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She greeted me with a smile, as if everything was perfectly normal, as if the last few hours hadn't turned my world upside down. I watched her move around the kitchen, setting the table, stirring the pot on the stove, and I realized how easy it had been for me to miss the signs. She'd been pulling away for months, but I had been too focused on work, too distracted by the everyday chaos of life, to notice. And now, as I stood there watching her, I couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. If I had already lost her, and I hadn't even realized it. The longer this went on, the more isolated I felt. It was like living in a house with walls closing in on me, suffocating in my own silence. Every day, I found myself retreating further into my own thoughts, trapped in a loop of suspicion and doubt. Laura was still the same on the surface, calm, composed, and acting like everything was fine. But beneath that facade, I could sense the distance growing between us. I became hyper-aware of everything. The way she would rush to answer her phone when it rang, stepping out of the room as if I couldn't hear her whispering conversations. The texts she received more frequently now, with notifications she'd glance at before quickly locking the screen. Even her laughter was different, lighter somehow, almost carefree. It felt like she was slipping away from me, piece by piece, and I didn't know how to hold on to her. One evening, I tried to reconnect with her, hoping we could get back to some semblance of normalcy. I suggested we go out to dinner, just the two of us. It had been months since we'd done anything alone together, and I was desperate to find some way back to what we used to have. "How about we go out tonight?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter while she chopped vegetables for dinner. She looked up surprised. "Out? I've already started cooking." "It's okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "We haven't gone out in a while. Let's take a break. I'll make a reservation at that Italian place you like." Her hesitation was brief, but noticeable. "I don't know. I'm kind of tired. It's been a long day." I felt a pang of disappointment, but forced myself to smile. "We could do it another time." She nodded, offering me a half-hearted smile in return. "Yeah, another time." But that time never came. Every time I suggested doing something together, she had an excuse ready. She was tired, had too much to do, or wanted to stay in. It was like she was building a fortress around herself, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through. Then there were the weekends. Before, weekends were our time to unwind together, spending lazy mornings in bed, catching up on shows, or taking the kids out to the park. But now, Laura was constantly finding reasons to be out of the house. She'd say she needed to run errands or meet with friends, and more often than not, Travis would end up staying late to finish up some project or other. I couldn't prove it, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just about work anymore. One Saturday afternoon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by sitting around pretending everything was fine. Laura had left early that morning, claiming she was meeting a friend for brunch. I watched her leave, feeling that familiar knot of unease tighten in my stomach. I couldn't just sit back and let this go on. After pacing the house for what felt like hours, I made a decision. I grabbed my car keys and followed her. I had never done something like this before, and the guilt gnawed at me as I drove through the neighborhood. But the need to know the truth outweighed any shame I felt. If something was going on, I couldn't keep burying my head in the sand. I trailed her at a distance, careful not to be seen. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself I was wrong, that I'd follow her to the restaurant and she'd be there with her friend, laughing and having brunch like any other Saturday. I wanted that more than anything, to be wrong. But when she turned off the main road and headed into a residential area, my stomach dropped. I followed, keeping a safe distance, until she pulled into a driveway. It wasn't a restaurant. It wasn't even a friend's house. It was a small, nondescript house on the edge of town. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I parked down the street, far enough away that she wouldn't see me, and watched as she stepped out of the car. She wasn't alone. Travis was there, waiting by the door. He greeted her with a smile, one I had seen too many times, and they disappeared inside. My mind went blank, the world around me spinning. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the house, trying to process what I had just seen. They were inside together, alone, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that everything I had feared was true. They were having an affair. I wanted to march up to that door, to confront them both and demand answers. I imagined the scene in my head, yelling accusations, maybe even a fight. But as I sat there, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I couldn't do it. I couldn't face it head on. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the fallout. Instead, I drove away. I drove aimlessly through town, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Every mile I put between myself and that house felt like a betrayal. To myself, to our marriage, to everything we had built. But I didn't know what else to do. I felt powerless, lost in a situation that I had no control over. When I finally returned home, the house was empty. Laura hadn't come back yet, and I was grateful for the silence. I sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, the smiling faces, the happy moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else. How had it come to this? How had we gone from being so in love, so connected, to this? That evening, when Laura finally returned home, she was her usual self, calm, composed, and acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and started preparing dinner like it was just another Saturday. I watched her, feeling like I was living in a dream, or maybe a nightmare, where everything looked normal on the surface, but underneath, everything was wrong. I didn't confront her. Not that night. Not the next day. I couldn't. I didn't know how. Every time I looked at her, I saw the house, I saw Travis, and I saw the betrayal. But I didn't have the strength to bring it up. What if I was wrong? What if it wasn't what I thought? Or worse, what if it was exactly what I thought, and once I said the words out loud, there would be no going back? So, I stayed quiet, but the silence was unbearable. And the more I kept it inside, the more it ate away at me. It was unbearable living like this. Every day felt like walking through quicksand, sinking deeper into the weight of everything I couldn't say. The house, our home, became a place of shadows, filled with things left unsaid, tensions we pretended weren't there. Every moment I spent with Laura felt like a performance, like we were playing roles in a marriage that no longer existed. She acted like nothing had changed, like we were still the same couple we'd always been. But I couldn't stop seeing her with him, in that house, laughing, sharing moments that should have belonged to us. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined them together. And with every passing day, the anger inside me grew, boiling just beneath the surface. I found myself withdrawing more and more, avoiding her when I could. The sight of her, the sound of her voice, it all felt like a reminder of what I couldn't face. I buried myself in work, leaving early and coming home late, using any excuse to stay out of the house. It wasn't sustainable. I knew that, but I wasn't ready to confront the truth yet. Not until I was sure I could handle what came next. Then came the night everything unraveled. It started like any other. Laura had cooked dinner, and we sat at the table together in silence, the sound of forks scraping plates the only thing between us. I glanced at her across the table, wondering if she felt the same tension I did, if she knew how close we were to falling apart. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "Travis finished up the patio today. It looks really good." I stared at her for a moment, wondering how she could talk about him so casually, as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't just spent the last few months lying to me. "That's great," I muttered, forcing myself to respond. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, he really went above and beyond." I couldn't do it anymore. The mask I had been wearing, the one that pretended everything was fine, finally cracked. I dropped my fork, the clatter of it hitting the plate loud in the quiet room. Laura looked up, startled. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft, cautious. I stared at her, my heart racing in my chest. For a moment, I thought about backing down, about retreating into silence like I had so many times before. But the anger that had been simmering inside me for weeks finally broke through, and I couldn't hold it back any longer. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her eyes widened in surprise. "What? Do you think I haven't noticed?" I continued, my voice rising. "Do you think I haven't seen the way you act around him? The way you light up every time he's around? Or the fact that you spend more time with him than you do with me?" She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Kurt," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me, Laura. I'm not blind. I'm not stupid. I know something's going on between you and Travis." For a moment, she just sat there, stunned into silence. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to respond. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "Nothing's going on," she finally said, her voice shaky. "I swear, Kurt, you're imagining things." I let out a bitter laugh. "Imagining things? I followed you, Laura. I saw you. I saw the two of you at that house." Her face went pale, and for the first time, I saw the truth in her eyes. She knew she'd been caught. There was no denying it now. "That's not what you think," she stammered, shaking her head. "It's not. Stop lying," I shouted, slamming my fist on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "I know what I saw. I know what you've been doing. Just admit it." She was trembling now, her hands clenched in a fist in her lap. She looked down at the table, avoiding my eyes. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. There it was, the confirmation I'd been dreading. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she'd just said, trying to understand how we'd gotten here. "How long?" I asked, my voice quieter now, the anger replaced by a hollow emptiness. Laura didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring at the table, tears welling up in her eyes. "How long, Laura?" I repeated, my voice breaking. "Since the renovation started," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Weeks, months, the entire time, she had been lying to me, deceiving me, pretending like everything was fine. I had been living in a house built on lies. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why am—" She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she whispered. "It just happened. It just happened?" I repeated, incredulous. "That's your explanation? You threw away everything we built because it just happened?" Tears started streaming down her face, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Kurt. I swear I didn't. But you were always so busy, and I felt so alone." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You felt alone? So you decided to screw around with the first guy who paid attention to you?" "It wasn't like that," she sobbed. "It's not just about that. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice rising again. "It's not complicated, Laura. You cheated. You betrayed me." She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. But I couldn't feel sympathy for her. Not now. Not after everything. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "I can't be here right now." Laura looked up, panic in her eyes. "Kurt, wait. Please." But I was already walking away, grabbing my keys from the counter and heading for the door. "Please don't leave," she cried, getting up to follow me. "We could talk about this. We can fix it." I stopped at the door, turning to face her one last time. "I don't know if we can," I said, my voice low and filled with sorrow. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." And with that, I walked out, leaving her standing there, sobbing in the doorway. I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away. Away from her, away from the house, away from everything. My mind was a mess, a storm of emotions I couldn't control. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. It was all too much. At some point, I found myself parked at the side of a quiet road, staring blankly out the window. My hands were still shaking, my heart racing, and I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Her confession, the way she'd looked at me, her eyes full of guilt and shame. How could she do this to me? How could she throw away everything we had for him? I felt sick to my stomach, the weight of it all crashing down on me. I had lost her. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I drove until my gas tank was nearly empty, the dark streets a blur as my thoughts circled endlessly. Every mile I put between me and home felt like a desperate attempt to escape the reality I didn't want to face. But no matter how far I went, the truth followed me. Laura had betrayed me. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was fact. And the worst part was that I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. Eventually, I found myself parked at a familiar spot, an old, empty parking lot by the lake where we used to go when we first started dating. Back then, everything had been simple. We were so in love, so certain that nothing could break us. Now, that felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory from a life that no longer belonged to me. I sat in the car staring out at the still water, trying to process everything. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound in the night, but inside my head, it was chaos. What was I supposed to do now? I had always thought that if something like this happened, I'd know exactly what to do. I'd leave, cut ties, and never look back. But now that I was in the middle of it, it wasn't that simple. Memories of our life together flashed through my mind. Our wedding day, the birth of our kids, all the small, intimate moments that had defined our life as a couple. We had built a life together, a family. How could she throw that all away? How could she betray everything we'd worked for? I thought about confronting Travis. The thought of him, the man who had come into my home, smiled at me, shaking my hand while carrying on with my wife, made my blood boil. I imagined going to him, yelling, throwing punches, making him feel even a fraction of the anger and pain that was tearing me apart inside. But what would that accomplish? Nothing. It wouldn't change what had already happened. So, I sat there, letting the cold night air seep into the car, wondering what I was supposed to do now. Eventually, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, needing to feel the cool air on my skin. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel small and alone in the world. I walked to the edge of the lake, staring out at the water, hoping that the calm surface would somehow settle the storm inside me. But it didn't. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed out as much as I could, avoiding home, avoiding Laura. I couldn't face her. Every time I thought about her, I saw her with him, and it made me sick. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. When I did go home, we barely spoke. She gave me space, but I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to say something, to give her a sign of what would happen next. But I didn't have any answers. I didn't know how to move forward. One evening, after days of silence between us, Laura finally spoke up. "Kurt, we can't keep living like this," she said softly, her voice hesitant as she stood in the doorway of our bedroom. "We need to talk." I was sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, staring down at the floor. I didn't look up. "What is there to talk about?" She took a deep breath, stepping further into the room. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust. But we can't just avoid this forever. We have to figure out where we go from here." "Where we go from here?" I repeated bitterly, finally looking up at her. "I don't even know if there is a we anymore." She flinched at my words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know, and that's my fault. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. To fix us. How do you expect to fix this, Laura? I asked, my voice rising in anger. You slept with him. You lied to me for months. How do you come back from that? She sat down beside me, her body tense. I don't have all the answers, Kurt, but I want to try. I don't want to throw away everything we've built together. I made a mistake, a horrible, unforgivable mistake, but I still love you. I turned away from her, shaking my head. You should have thought about that before you started sleeping with him. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Laura wiped her eyes, her voice cracking as she said, I know you hate me right now. I hate myself too. But please, Kurt, we owe it to ourselves, to our family, to at least try. For the first time in days, I let myself really look at her. The woman I had loved for years was sitting beside me, broken, remorseful. But all I could see was the betrayal. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she was truly sorry and that we could somehow rebuild what had been shattered. But I wasn't sure if I could. How do I trust you again? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Laura took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. I don't know. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try. I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever you need. Just don't walk away from us. I stared at her hands, still unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to pull away, to reject her, to let the anger and hurt drive me out of the room and out of this marriage for good. But another part of me, maybe the part that still remembered the love we once had, wanted to believe that there was a way back, that we could somehow find our way through this, even if I didn't know how. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice raw with emotion. She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I understand. I'll wait as long as it takes. But please, Kurt, just give us a chance. I sat there, torn between the overwhelming hurt and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving. I didn't know what the future held, or if I would ever be able to forgive her. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Not yet. We'll see. I finally said, my voice heavy with uncertainty. But I can't make any promises. Laura let out a shaky breath, nodding. That's all I'm asking for. Over the next few days, things shifted. We talked more, tentative, cautious conversations filled with apologies and explanations. Laura told me how it started, how she'd felt neglected, invisible even. She explained how Travis had filled that void, how it began as innocent conversations and slowly turned into something more. I didn't want to hear it, but I listened. I needed to know why, even if it wouldn't change what had happened. She begged for forgiveness, promised she'd never see him again, swore that she'd do anything to make it right. But I couldn't promise her anything in return. I was still too raw, too hurt. The trust between us was shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. But for the sake of our family, I was willing to at least try. I agreed to counseling, something I had never imagined we would need. We went together, sitting in a small room with a therapist who guided us through our first steps toward healing. It was uncomfortable, painful even, but it was a start. I knew it would be a long road ahead. Forgiveness, if it ever came, wouldn't happen overnight. The betrayal would always be there, lingering in the background, a shadow over everything. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through the wreckage. Months passed, and though the sharp edges of my anger had dulled, the weight of what had happened still lingered. Counseling had become a regular part of our lives, a place where Laura and I unpacked the mess we'd created, one painful session at a time. Some days, it felt like we were making progress, like we might actually survive this. Other days, the wounds felt as fresh as they had the night I discovered her betrayal. But we kept going. For the kids, for our history, for the tiny sliver of hope that maybe we could rebuild something from the ashes of what we once had. Laura tried, I'll give her that. She cut all ties with Travis, and I never saw or heard his name again. She was more present, more open, more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. At times, it almost felt like we were getting to know each other all over again. Two people who had lost their way, but were trying to find a new path. But trust was a different story. I couldn't erase the memory of her and Travis. Couldn't forget the lies she had told, the secrets she had kept. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever feel safe again, if I'd ever be able to look at her without the ghost of that betrayal hanging over us. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the house quiet after the kids had gone to bed, Laura turned to me. "Kurt," she began softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I know it's been hard. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't ever fully repair. But I need to know, can you see us moving forward? Can you see us rebuilding?" I looked at her, searching her face for the woman I had once loved without question. She was still there, but different. We both were. "I don't know," I said honestly, the weight of my uncertainty settling between us. I've tried to forgive you, to move past what happened, but I'm still not sure I can. Every day, it's like a battle between wanting to trust you again and not being able to forget." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I do. But I love you, Kurt. I want this to work. I want us to be a family again." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I love you too, Laura. But love isn't enough to fix this. Trust was broken. And no matter how much we try, I don't know if we'll ever be able to get back to what we had." She looked down, wiping away a tear. "So, what now?" There was a long silence, the kind that fills a room and presses down on you until you can hardly breathe. I thought about everything, the life we'd built, the memories, the years. And then I thought about the future, about the kind of life I wanted for myself and our kids. A life free of suspicion and pain. "I think maybe we need to take a break," I said quietly, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Maybe some time apart will help us figure out what we really want, what we really need." Laura's breath hitched, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm saying I need time to think." "We both do." She didn't argue. Maybe she knew, deep down, that I was right. Maybe she felt it too, the heaviness between us, the weight of the past that neither of us could shake. We agreed to separate, at least for a while. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, close enough to be there for the kids, but far enough to give us both space. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for us, but maybe it wasn't the end at all. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new. Whether together or apart, I didn't know yet. As I stood in my new, empty apartment, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, relief, fear, hope. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Maybe, in time, we'd find our way back to each other. Or maybe we'd find peace in moving on. Either way, it was time to let go of the past.